Margaret Chen didn't just have money. She had the kind of wealth that most people only see in movies. Her apartment sat at the top of one of Manhattan's most expensive buildings, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Central Park. Inside, every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every vase holding fresh flowers cost more than what most families earned in a year. But Margaret rarely noticed these things anymore. When you have everything, nothing feels special. What she did notice was when things didn't run smoothly. And for 15 years, things had run very smoothly thanks to Rosa. Rosa Martinez was the kind of housekeeper who made wealthy people feel like their lives just naturally fell into place. She arrived early, worked quietly, and left everything perfect. The floors always gleamed. The flowers were always fresh. The coffee was always ready at exactly 7 in the morning. Margaret sometimes went days without actually speaking to Rosa beyond a quick nod or a short instruction. Rosa had a son. His name was Daniel, and he was 23 years old. He'd just finished college. Not one of the fancy schools Margaret donated to, but a community college where he'd worked 2 jobs to pay his tuition. Now he was working evening shifts at an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, serving pasta to tourists and saving every dollar he could. Sometimes, when Daniel's schedule allowed, he'd pick up his mother from work. Margaret had seen him a handful of times over the years. A polite young man, always standing by the service entrance and scrolling through his phone while he waited. She'd never really thought about him beyond that. He was Rosa's son. That was the extent of his identity in her world. Everything changed on a Tuesday evening in October. Margaret was hosting a dinner party. Not a huge event, just 8 people. But these weren't just any 8 people. They were investors. The kind who could write checks with so many zeros that even Margaret paid attention. She'd spent weeks planning every detail. The menu had been crafted by her private chef. The wine had been selected from her personal collection. And the atmosphere, that intangible feeling of elegance and sophistication, would be set by a pianist playing softly in the corner. At 4 in the afternoon, Margaret's phone rang. It was the pianist calling to cancel. A family emergency, he said, his voice apologetic but firm. He couldn't make it. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. She didn't lose her composure often, but this was a problem. A silent dinner party felt too formal, too stiff. But the wrong music would be even worse. She needed someone who could play beautifully but not demand attention. Background elegance. That was the goal. She was pacing in her study, mentally running through every connection she had, when Rosa appeared at the door. Rosa always knocked softly, waited to be acknowledged. Years of working in wealthy homes had taught her to be nearly invisible until she was needed. But now she cleared her throat, something she almost never did. "Mrs. Chen," Rosa said quietly, "I might have a solution. My son Daniel, he plays piano. If you need someone for tonight, he could help." Margaret turned to look at Rosa properly for the first time that day. The housekeeper's face showed nothing but calm helpfulness. But there was something in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or nervousness. Margaret's first instinct was to say no. This was an important evening. She needed a professional, someone with experience playing for sophisticated audiences. But she was out of options and time was running out. "Can he play Chopin?" Margaret asked. "Debussy? Classical pieces?" "Yes, ma'am." "He studied piano for many years," Margaret calculated quickly. The risk of Daniel being terrible versus the certainty of having no music at all. "Fine, have him here by 6. And Rosa, please make sure he understands this is just background music. Nothing complicated or attention-seeking, just pleasant." "I understand, Mrs. Chen. Thank you." An hour later, Daniel arrived. Margaret watched him walk into her home carrying an old backpack, wearing jeans and a sweater that had clearly seen better days. He was taller than she remembered, with his mother's kind eyes but something else in his expression. Uncertainty, maybe. Or was it something more? He stood in the marble entryway looking around at the art and the grand piano in the living room, like he'd stepped into a different universe. Which Margaret supposed he had. "You can play, correct?" Margaret asked, not unkindly but not warmly either. This was business. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied. His voice was steady. "I need background music. Elegant, classical. Nothing that will distract from conversation. Can you do that?" Something flickered across Daniel's face, too quick for Margaret to read. "Yes, I can do that." "Good. There's a bathroom down the hall if you need to prepare. My guests will arrive at 7. Daniel nodded and moved toward the piano. Margaret watched him sit down, adjust the bench, and place his fingers on the keys. He paused for just a moment, took a breath, and began to play. The music that filled the room was perfect. Not too loud, not too soft. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, played with technical precision and just enough feeling to make it beautiful without being emotional. Exactly what Margaret had asked for. She felt herself relax. This would work. When her guests arrived, the apartment looked like something from a magazine. Candles flickered on every surface. The table was set with china that cost more per plate than Daniel made in a week. And from the corner of the living room, piano music drifted through the air like an expensive perfume. Margaret greeted her guests with confidence, guiding them through her home, pouring wine, laughing at jokes, making subtle pitches for her latest business venture. The evening flowed exactly as she'd planned. The piano played on. Daniel moved from Chopin to Debussy to Satie, each piece blending into the next with seamless skill. But Margaret barely heard it. The music had become what she'd wanted it to be, present but unimportant, noticed but not remembered. Around 10 o'clock, after the last guest had left with promises to call their lawyers in the morning, Margaret walked back into the living room. Daniel was still sitting at the piano, closing the lid gently. "That was fine," Margaret said, reaching for her purse. She pulled out 5 $10 bills and held them out. "Thank you for filling in." Daniel took the money, folding it carefully. "You're welcome, Mrs. Chen. You play well enough. If I need someone again, I might call on you." "Of course," Daniel said quietly. He gathered his backpack and headed toward the door where his mother was waiting, having finished cleaning the kitchen. Margaret watched them leave together, Rosa's hand briefly touching her son's shoulder as they stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, Margaret had already forgotten about them. She had emails to answer, contracts to review, an empire to run. The piano player had served his purpose. Nothing more needed to be thought about it. She didn't see the way Daniel's hands had trembled slightly when he played. She didn't know that every note he'd performed had felt like speaking in a whisper when he wanted to shout. She didn't realize that sitting at that piano, playing music designed to be ignored, had been both a gift and a quiet heartbreak. But she would learn. Eventually, Margaret Chen would learn exactly what she'd failed to hear that evening. She just didn't know it yet. 3 months passed, and Daniel became Margaret's regular solution whenever she needed piano music. It started with another dinner party, then a small business gathering, then a Sunday brunch for her sister's birthday. Each time Margaret would text Rosa the day before, sometimes just hours before, asking if Daniel was available. He always was. Between his restaurant shifts and the few private students he taught piano to, Daniel would rearrange his schedule to play for Margaret. The money helped. $50 for 2 or 3 hours of playing was more than he made serving tables, but it was more than that. Every time he sat at that magnificent Steinway grand piano, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not quite hope, not quite pain, something in between. Margaret never asked him what he wanted to play. She'd simply say the usual, or something elegant, or keep it light tonight, and Daniel would nod and deliver exactly what she expected. Chopin, Debussy, Bach, Mozart, safe choices. Beautiful but predictable. Music that wealthy people recognized without really listening to. What Margaret didn't know, what she never thought to ask, was what Daniel did when he wasn't playing background music for her world. Late at night, after his restaurant shift ended and his mother was asleep, Daniel would take the subway to a community center in the Bronx. In the basement, there was an old upright piano that was out of tune and missing 2 keys. The room smelled like dust and someone was always practicing drums in the next room, the bass thumping through the walls. But that's where Daniel truly played. His compositions poured out in that basement. Music that blended everything he'd ever learned, everything he'd ever felt. Classical structures built on jazz harmonies, contemporary rhythms wrapped around melodies that could make you cry. He wrote about his mother's hands worn from years of cleaning other people's homes. He wrote about the feeling of being invisible in a room full of people. He wrote about dreams that felt too big to speak out loud. One evening, he'd been playing at a small wedding for a friend of a friend. It was in a cramped restaurant in Queens, nothing fancy. But someone had been listening, really listening. Her name was Professor Helen Zhao, and she taught at the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. She'd been there as someone's aunt, bored and checking her phone until Daniel started playing. She'd put her phone down. Then she'd stood up and moved closer. When the wedding ended, she'd waited by the piano. "Who taught you to compose like that?" she'd asked. Daniel had looked at her, confused. I teach myself, I guess." Professor Zhao had pulled out her card. "I've been teaching at the conservatory for 20 years. What you're doing, the way you're blending styles, the emotional depth, it's extraordinary. This is the most original voice I've heard in a decade." Daniel had taken the card with shaking hands. "We have a showcase every spring," she'd continued. "Young musicians perform for industry professionals, critics, producers. I want you to apply. I can get you a full scholarship to study with us, but you need to be in that showcase. 3 months from now. Can you prepare a portfolio?" Daniel had said yes before his brain could catch up to his mouth. Yes, he could do this. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now Daniel was working on his portfolio every spare moment, recording his compositions on his phone because he couldn't afford proper equipment, writing out sheet music by hand, practicing until his fingers ached. The showcase was his chance. His one real chance to be seen as more than Rose's son, more than background music, more than the help. Meanwhile, Margaret's perfect business empire had hit an unexpected storm. A competitor, a tech company out of California, had launched a product that was cutting into her market share. For the first time in 5 years, Chen Industries was losing ground. Margaret's investors were nervous. Her board was asking hard questions. She needed something bold, something that would remind everyone why she'd built a billion-dollar company in the first place. Her annual charity gala was coming up in 2 months. Usually it was just another event on her calendar. Rich people writing tax-deductible checks while eating expensive food and congratulating themselves on their generosity. But this year, Margaret needed it to be more. She needed something memorable, something that would get people talking. Her event coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who'd planned galas for 3 presidents, suggested they do something different with the entertainment. "Everyone does the same thing," Patricia had said over coffee in Margaret's office. "String quartet, jazz band, maybe a singer if they're feeling bold. What if we did something that actually surprised people? Something artistic and unexpected?" Margaret had leaned back in her chair. "Like what?" "A performance piece. Something original. We book the Plaza Ballroom, we get Manhattan's elite in the room, and we give them something they've never seen before. It becomes the story of the evening." Margaret had liked the idea immediately. Bold, different. The kind of move that reminded people she didn't play it safe. "Do you have someone in mind?" Margaret had asked. Patricia had started listing names. Classical performers, contemporary artists, people whose fees started at $20,000. Margaret had listened, but her mind had drifted. She needed something perfect, something that fit the tone she was going for. Then she thought of Daniel. He was reliable. He played well. He knew how to perform without overshadowing the event. And more importantly, she could control the narrative. Young musician from humble background given opportunity at prestigious gala. Her competitors would be talking about quarterly reports while she'd be on social media, looking generous and cultured. "I have someone," Margaret had said, cutting off Patricia mid-sentence. "That pianist I use for parties. Rose's son. Have him prepare something impressive for the gala. Something classical but challenging. Something that shows technical skill." Patricia had looked uncertain. "Mrs. Chen, this is the Plaza. In front of 500 people, including critics and media. Are you sure about using someone who usually plays dinner parties?" "He's good enough," Margaret had said with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about business decisions. "Set it up." That evening, when Rosa was cleaning Margaret's study, Margaret had mentioned it casually. "The gala in 2 months. I'd like Daniel to perform. It's a bigger event, so I'll pay him $200. Have him prepare something impressive. A challenging classical piece, something that sounds sophisticated." Rosa had paused in her dusting. "Mrs. Chen, Daniel has been working on his own compositions. Original music. Perhaps he could play something he wrote?" Margaret had waved her hand, already turning back to her laptop. "Whatever he thinks is best, as long as it sounds good. Nothing too experimental. I need elegant and impressive, not weird." Rosa had nodded slowly. "I'll tell him." That night, when Rosa got home to their small apartment in Washington Heights, she found Daniel at the kitchen table surrounded by sheet music and recording equipment borrowed from a friend. "Mama," he'd said, looking up with exhausted eyes. Only 7 weeks until the showcase. I'm not ready. The portfolio needs to be perfect. Rosa had set down her bag and put a hand on her son's shoulder. I have something to tell you. Mrs. Chen wants you to perform at her big charity gala. 2 months from now. Daniel had frozen. That's a week before my showcase. I know. What does she want me to play? Rosa had smiled sadly. She said you could choose. Something impressive. I mentioned your compositions. Daniel had stared at the sheet music in front of him. His original piece, the one he'd been perfecting for the showcase. The one that told his story, his truth. The piece Professor Zhao had called extraordinary. She doesn't actually want to hear what I can really do, Daniel had said quietly. She wants background music that sounds impressive. There's a difference. Maybe, Rosa had said. Or maybe this is your chance to show her who you really are. Daniel had looked at his mother, this woman who'd spent 15 years making someone else's life beautiful. While her own dreams got smaller and quieter, she'd never complained, never asked for recognition. But in her eyes now he saw something that made his chest tight. She believed in him, even when he barely believed in himself. Okay, Daniel had said, I'll do it. But I'm playing my music. My real music. If she doesn't like it, at least I'll know I tried. Rosa had kissed the top of his head like she did when he was little. That's my son. Neither of them knew that decision would change everything. That in 2 months in that grand ballroom full of Manhattan's most powerful people, Daniel would stop being invisible. But for now, he had work to do. He returned to his sheet music, his borrowed microphone, his dreams that felt too big for their tiny apartment but somehow, impossibly, were about to become real. The night of the gala arrived faster than Daniel expected. 2 months of preparation, of doubt, of rehearsing in that dusty basement until his fingers knew every note by memory. 2 months of working double shifts at the restaurant to save money for a decent suit. 2 months of his mother telling him to breathe, to trust himself, to remember why he made music in the first place. Now he stood backstage at the Plaza Hotel, and everything felt surreal. The ballroom was massive. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky. Round tables covered in white cloth stretched across the room, each one set with china and silverware that probably cost more than his rent. Flowers everywhere, the kind that didn't have price tags because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford them. Through a gap in the curtain, Daniel watched the guests arrive. Women in gowns that shimmered under the lights, men in tuxedos that fit like they were born wearing them. Everyone moved with that casual confidence that came from never worrying about money, never wondering if they belonged. Daniel looked down at his own suit. It was the nicest thing he'd ever owned, bought from a department store with his savings. It fit well enough, but next to these people, he felt like he was wearing a costume. His stomach twisted. What was he thinking? These people didn't want to hear his music. They wanted what Margaret always wanted. Background noise. Something pretty and forgettable, something that wouldn't challenge them or make them feel anything too deeply. He could still change his mind. He'd brought sheet music for Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 just in case. He could play that instead. It was challenging, impressive, exactly what Margaret asked for. Safe. But then he thought about Professor Zhao, about his mother, about every night in that basement, pouring his heart into music that no one had heard yet. If not now, when? If not here, where? His phone buzzed. A text from his mom, who was somewhere in this massive hotel, probably in the kitchen area helping coordinate something even though this wasn't her job. I'm proud of you, no matter what happens. Play your music. Daniel put his phone away and closed his eyes. Okay. He was doing this. In the ballroom, Margaret worked the room like the expert she was. A smile here, a handshake there, remembering names and faces and which companies each person represented. Her dress was midnight blue, designer, elegant without being showy. She'd learned long ago that real power didn't need to announce itself. The business troubles of the past months had been exhausting, but tonight was going well. She'd already had 3 promising conversations with investors. The food was excellent. The atmosphere was exactly right. And in 20 minutes, Daniel would play something impressive. People would applaud politely, and the evening would end with her looking like someone who supported the arts while also running a successful empire. Everything was going according to plan. Patricia, the event coordinator, appeared at her elbow. Mrs. Chen, the performance is in 15 minutes. I wanted to confirm with you. The pianist is playing an original composition? Margaret frowned slightly. Original? I thought I said classical. You said he could choose as long as it was impressive. He's been rehearsing an original piece. I assumed you approved it. Margaret felt a flicker of irritation. She didn't like surprises. But there wasn't time to change things now, and honestly, how different could it be? Piano music was piano music. As long as it sounded sophisticated, it would be fine. It's fine, Margaret said. Let's proceed. At 9 o'clock, the lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the grand piano at the front of the ballroom. The conversation didn't stop entirely. People were still talking, still networking, but the volume dropped a bit. Daniel walked out to scattered applause. He sat at the piano bench, adjusted his position, and looked out at the sea of faces. He found his mother standing near the back, her hands clasped together. She nodded at him, and he felt something settle in his chest. This was it. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The piece started quietly, a single melody line, simple and haunting, like a question being asked. For the first few seconds, it could have been classical, could have been safe. Then it changed. Daniel's left hand came in with a jazz progression that no one expected. The melody twisted, became more complex, building on itself. His right hand danced across the keys, adding layers of rhythm and harmony that didn't belong in traditional classical music, but somehow fit perfectly. Near the back of the room, a waiter stopped mid-pour. A woman reaching for her wine glass froze with her hand in the air. The music built, telling a story without words. It spoke of early mornings and late nights, of hands that worked until they ached, of dreams deferred but never forgotten, of being in rooms where no one saw you even when you were right there. Conversations stopped. Forks were set down quietly on plates. People who'd come here expecting background noise found themselves unable to look away. Daniel's eyes were closed now, his entire body moving with the music. This was what he'd kept locked inside every time he played Chopin for Margaret's dinner parties. This was the music that lived in that basement in the Bronx. This was him, all of him, nothing held back. Margaret had been in conversation with a potential partner, discussing profit margins and market share. She was mid-sentence when she registered what she was hearing. Her words trailed off. She turned toward the piano. It took her a moment to process that it was Daniel playing. The same Daniel who'd been providing background music for months. But this wasn't background anything. This was urgent and powerful and unlike anything she'd expected. She watched his hands move across the keys, watched his face show every emotion the music carried. And for the first time since she'd met him, she really saw him. Not as Rose's son, not as the helps kid who could play piano, but as an artist, as someone with a gift she'd been too blind to recognize. The music reached its climax, multiple melodies weaving together in a complexity that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. It was chaos and order at the same time. It was pain and hope and defiance all at once. Then gradually it began to soften. The jazz elements faded. The complexity simplified. The piece ended where it began, with that single haunting melody, but now it felt different. Not like a question anymore, like an answer. The final note hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, gradually fading into silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. The ballroom was completely silent. Then someone started clapping. Not polite applause, real enthusiastic clapping. Someone else joined in, then another person. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted. People stood up. The applause became thunderous. Daniel opened his eyes, looking stunned. He hadn't expected this. He'd been prepared for polite acknowledgement or confused silence. Not this. People rushed toward the piano. Margaret found herself pushed aside by the crowd. She watched, frozen in place as person after person congratulated Daniel, asked for his contact information, pulled out their phones to take photos with him. Near the edge of the crowd, she noticed a man in his 60s with silver hair. He was someone important, she could tell by the way others made space for him. He reached Daniel and handed him a business card, speaking intently. Daniel's eyes went wide as he listened. Patricia appeared at Margaret's side again. "Mrs. Chen, do you know who that is?" "That's Vincent Webb, the music producer. He's discovered some of the biggest names in contemporary classical music. He's talking to your pianist." Margaret felt something unfamiliar sink into her stomach. Not jealousy, not anger, Something worse. Shame. She thought about every time she'd asked Daniel to play and barely listened. Every $50 payment for music that was worth so much more. Every time she'd seen him as background, as convenient, as forgettable. She'd built her entire career on recognizing potential, on seeing value where others missed it, on being smarter and more perceptive than her competitors, but she'd failed to see genius sitting at her own piano, playing music she was too distracted to really hear. And the worst part? It wasn't because Daniel had hidden his talent. It was because she'd already decided who he was before she gave him a chance to show her. Rosa appeared in her peripheral vision, tears streaming down her face, pushing through the crowd toward her son. When she reached him, Daniel stood and hugged her, lifting her off the ground. Margaret watched them, mother and son, celebrating this moment together. She should feel proud. She'd given him this opportunity, this stage. But she hadn't, not really. She'd offered him a chance to be background music at her event. He'd taken that chance and turned it into something she never imagined. The question that burned in her mind was simple and painful. How much other genius had she walked past in her life? Too busy or too certain of her own importance to notice, Margaret turned away from the crowd and walked to the balcony, suddenly needing air. Through the windows, Manhattan stretched out in all directions. Millions of lights, millions of people, each one with their own story she'd never hear. Inside, the celebration continued. Daniel's life was changing by the minute, and Margaret had accidentally been part of making that happen. But as she stood there in the cold November air, she knew the real change hadn't happened to Daniel tonight. It had happened to her, and she had no idea what to do about it. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment still wearing her gala dress, scrolling through her phone as the sun came up over Central Park. The videos had started appearing within an hour of Daniel's performance. Someone had recorded it and posted it online. Then another person posted from a different angle. Then another. By midnight, the videos had thousands of views. By 3 a.m, hundreds of thousands. By sunrise, millions. The comments kept coming. Who is this guy? This is the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. Why have we never heard of him before? Music critics were tweeting. Bloggers were writing articles. News sites were picking up the story. But that wasn't what kept Margaret awake. Her assistant had sent her the morning papers at 6. The gala was covered, yes, but not the way Margaret had planned. The headlines weren't about Chen Industries or her business comeback. They were about Daniel. Unknown composer stuns Manhattan elite with revolutionary performance. Viral piano performance captivates millions overnight. The story behind the pianist. Everyone's talking about. And in several articles, there was a detail that made Margaret's stomach turn. Daniel Martinez, son of a housekeeper who had been playing background music at private events for months before anyone noticed his talent. Her phone rang. It was Patricia, the event coordinator, calling way too early and way too excited. "Mrs. Chen, have you seen the response? This is incredible publicity. Everyone's talking about your gala. We should schedule a press conference, maybe with you and Daniel together, talking about how you discovered him and gave him this platform. This is exactly the kind of story people love." Margaret closed her eyes. "I didn't discover him, Patricia. I hired him to play background music." "There's a difference." There was a pause on the other end. "Well, yes, but you gave him the opportunity. You recognized his potential." "No," Margaret said quietly. "I didn't. I'll call you later." She hung up and set her phone face down on the table. At 8 o'clock, Rosa arrived for work. Margaret heard the key in the door, heard Rosa's familiar footsteps in the hallway. She thought about pretending she wasn't home, but that felt cowardly. "Mrs. Chen?" Rosa's voice came from the kitchen. "I didn't expect you to be awake so early." Margaret walked into the kitchen. Rosa was putting away her coat, her face tired but glowing with something Margaret had never seen there before. Pure joy. "Rosa, could you sit down for a moment? I need to talk to you." Rosa's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. Years of working for wealthy families had taught her that "we need to talk" rarely meant anything good. But she sat at the kitchen table, folding her hands in her lap. Margaret sat across from her. For a long moment, she didn't know how to start. "Your son is extraordinarily talented," she finally said. Rosa smiled softly. "Yes, he is. Why didn't you tell me? All these months I had him playing at dinner parties, paying him pocket change, and he's capable of what he did last night." Rosa's smile faded. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was hard to read. Not angry, not accusatory, but something that cut deeper. Mrs. Chen, I tried to tell you, several times. When you first asked him to play, I mentioned he composed his own music. You said you wanted classical pieces. When you asked him to perform at the gala, I told you he had original compositions. You said whatever he thought was best as long as it sounded sophisticated. Margaret felt her face flush. But you could have insisted. You could have made me understand. Could I? Rosa's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Chen, with respect, you've employed me for 15 years. In all that time, how many real conversations have we had? How many times have you asked me about my life, my family, my son's dreams? You are a kind employer. You pay fairly. You've never been cruel. But you've also never been curious. The words landed like stones. Margaret wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she couldn't. Because Rosa was right. For 5 years, Rosa continued, Daniel played piano in your home. Beautiful, skilled piano. But you heard what you expected to hear. Background music from the help's son. You never asked if there was more because you'd already decided there wasn't. Margaret's throat felt tight. I'm sorry. I know you are, Rosa said. But Mrs. Chen, it's not just me you need to apologize to. After Rosa went back to work, Margaret sat alone with her coffee getting cold. Her phone kept buzzing with messages, emails, calls. Everyone wanted to talk about the gala, about Daniel, about the viral sensation. One message stood out. It was from a board member of the Chen Foundation, her own charitable organization that funded emerging artists. They'd been trying to reach her since early morning. She called back. Margaret, thank goodness, the board member said. We need to discuss this Daniel Martinez situation. The young man from your gala. Have you seen his story? Working class background, community college education, completely self-taught as a composer. He's exactly what our young virtuoso grant was created for. Margaret frowned. The grant? We want to give him the award. $100,000, full mentorship program, connections to the industry's top professionals. The board voted this morning. We're unanimous. This is why we created the foundation. To find and support extraordinary talent that might otherwise be overlooked. Margaret felt a strange urge to laugh, but it wasn't funny. Her own foundation, created with her money to support artists, wanted to give an award to someone she'd been paying $50 to provide background music. The irony was almost too much. Does the board know about my connection to him? She asked. That he performed at your gala? Of course. That's how we discovered him. Why? He's been working for me for months. His mother is my housekeeper. I've had him playing piano at my private events. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Oh, the board member said finally. That's quite a story. Yes, it is, Margaret said, and not a flattering one for me. She spent the rest of the morning thinking. Then she made a decision. That afternoon, Margaret called an emergency board meeting for the Chen Foundation. She sat at the head of the table, looking at the faces of people she'd carefully selected for their expertise in arts and culture. I want to talk about the Daniel Martinez grant, she began. But first I need to tell you something about my own failure. She explained everything. How she'd employed Daniel for months without really seeing him. How she'd paid him minimum wage for talent worth thousands. How his mother had tried to tell her and she hadn't listened. How she'd been given opportunity after opportunity to recognize genius, and she'd been too distracted, too certain of her own perceptions, too quick to categorize people into boxes they couldn't escape from. The foundation should absolutely give Daniel the grant, she said. He deserves it. But I won't be part of that decision. I'm recusing myself, and I want to do something else, something separate. She outlined her plan. Not just funding for Daniel, though she'd offer that, but something bigger. A scholarship fund specifically for the children of domestic workers. People whose parents cleaned homes and raised other people's children and kept wealthy lives running smoothly while their own talents and dreams went unnoticed. I want to call it the Rosa Martinez Scholarship, Margaret said, after Daniel's mother. Because she spent 15 years making my life better, and I never once asked what her dreams were. I never asked what gifts her family had that I was too privileged to see. One of the board members spoke up. That's a beautiful gesture, Margaret. But is it enough? I mean, don't take this wrong, but it sounds like you're trying to make yourself feel better. Margaret nodded slowly. You're right. It's not enough. But it's a start. That evening, Margaret did something she'd never done before. She asked Rosa if they could talk after work. Really talk? Not as employer and employee, but as two people who'd existed in the same space for 15 years without ever really knowing each other. They sat in Margaret's living room, the same room where Daniel had played so many times. Rosa looked uncomfortable on the expensive couch, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to sit there. "Tell me about yourself," Margaret said. "Not about your work. About you, your life, your dreams. The things I should have asked about years ago." Rosa hesitated, then began to speak. She talked about growing up in El Salvador, about coming to America at 19 with nothing, about working 3 jobs to put herself through English classes, about meeting her husband, losing him to cancer when Daniel was 10, about the poetry she used to write late at night, before she was too tired to think in metaphors anymore. Margaret listened, really listened, and felt something crack open inside her chest. This woman, who she'd seen almost every day for 15 years, was a complete person with a complete life, and Margaret had never bothered to ask. "Rosa," Margaret said when she finished, "I want to offer Daniel funding for his career. Whatever he needs. And I want to create the scholarship in your name. But I need to know, is there anything you want? For yourself?" Rosa smiled sadly. "Mrs. Chen, I'm 56 years old. My dreams are for my son now. That's not what I asked." Rosa looked down at her hands, worn from years of work. "I used to want to write," she said quietly. "But that life isn't for people like me." "What if it could be?" Margaret asked. For the first time in 15 years, Rosa met Margaret's eyes as an equal. "Then I'd like to try again." Margaret nodded. "Then let's make that happen too." Outside, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the city, Daniel's phone was ringing with opportunities he'd dreamed about his whole life. The world was finally seeing him, but in this apartment something quieter was happening. Something that would take longer to fix but mattered just as much. Margaret was finally learning to see. 2 weeks after the gala, Margaret finally sat down with Daniel. She'd wanted to reach out sooner, but his phone had been ringing nonstop. Record labels, concert halls, talk shows, even a documentary crew that wanted to film his story. The world had discovered Daniel Martinez, and everyone wanted a piece of him. They met at a small coffee shop in Washington Heights, Daniel's neighborhood. Margaret could have suggested somewhere in Manhattan, somewhere expensive and impressive. But she was trying to learn, trying to understand that convenience wasn't always about her. Daniel looked different. Not physically, he was wearing the same type of clothes he always wore. But he carried himself differently, like someone who'd spent his whole life bracing for rejection and was still getting used to the fact that it hadn't come. "Thank you for meeting me," Margaret said as they sat down with their coffee. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. Please, call me Margaret." Daniel nodded but looked uncomfortable. Some habits were hard to break. Margaret took a breath. She'd rehearsed this conversation in her head a dozen times, but now that she was here, the words felt inadequate. "I owe you an apology," she began. "A real one, not the kind people give to make themselves feel better. I had you playing in my home for months and I never really listened. I never asked about your music, your training, your dreams. I paid you $50 to do something worth thousands. And worse than that, I never saw you as anything more than Rosa's son who could fill in when I needed background music." Daniel was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. "I knew that," he finally said. "I always knew that's how you saw me. Then why did you keep coming back?" "Because I needed the money. Because it meant I got to play a Steinway grand piano even if no one was listening. And because—" He paused. "Because I kept hoping that maybe one time you'd actually hear me. Really hear me." The words hurt more than Margaret expected. "I'm sorry I didn't." "I know you are," Daniel said. He didn't sound angry, just tired. "Mrs. Chen, Margaret, everyone wants to talk to me now. Record deals, performances, interviews. Vincent Webb, the producer who gave me his card at the gala, he wants to record an album. The conservatory showcase I was preparing for doesn't even matter anymore because I've already got everything that showcase was supposed to give me." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, and she meant it. "It is," Daniel agreed. "But I need you to understand something. You didn't make this happen. You gave me a stage, yes, but you didn't believe in me. You didn't see my potential. You accidentally put me in front of people who could actually listen." "There's a difference," Margaret nodded slowly. You're right, and I want to make things right. I want to fund your career, whatever you need. Equipment, studio time, housing so you don't have to work at the restaurant anymore. No strings attached. Daniel set down his coffee cup. Why? Because I failed to see what was right in front of me and I want to correct that. No, Daniel said firmly. I mean, why now? Why after I've already proven myself to the world? Where was this offer 6 months ago when I was playing in basements and recording on my phone? When I actually needed someone to believe in me? Margaret felt her face flush. She had no good answer. Mrs. Chen, Margaret, Daniel continued, his voice gentler now. I appreciate the gesture. I do, but I don't need you to rescue me now. I needed recognition then, when I was invisible. When my mother was telling you about my music and you weren't interested enough to listen, that's when your support would have mattered. So you're saying no? I'm saying I've learned something important from you, even if you didn't mean to teach it. I learned to stop waiting for permission to be extraordinary. I learned that sometimes the people who should see you won't, and you have to find the courage to show yourself anyway. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the neighborhood moved around them. People going to work, coming home, living their lives. Real lives that Margaret had spent her whole existence looking past. There is something you could do, though, Daniel said. Something that would actually mean something. Anything. My mother, Rosa. She's worked for you for 15 years. She's made your life better every single day. She put me through college while cleaning your home. She supported my dreams while her own got smaller and smaller. If you want to do something meaningful, do something for her. Margaret leaned forward. I've already talked to her about the scholarship fund. In her name. For children of domestic workers. That's good, Daniel said. That's really good. But I mean something more. My mom used to write poetry. Beautiful stuff. She'd write late at night after work, after taking care of me in whatever time she had left. She stopped years ago because she was too tired. Because she convinced herself that dreams like that weren't for people like her. What if you helped her start again? Not as charity. As recognition that she's a whole person with talents you never bothered to notice. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I'd like that. I've already offered, actually. But Daniel, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing any of this to make myself feel better, or to fix my reputation. I'm doing it because you and your mother taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. That I've been walking through the world blind. Daniel smiled for the first time since they'd sat down. Then maybe something good came out of all this after all. They talked for another hour. Really talked. Daniel told her about his music, his process, his dreams of performing at Carnegie Hall someday. Margaret listened without interrupting, without checking her phone, without thinking about her next meeting. Just listening. When they stood to leave, Daniel held out his hand. Margaret shook it. Thank you for the opportunity at the gala, Daniel said. Even if it wasn't what you intended, it changed my life. Thank you for being brave enough to play your truth, Margaret replied. Even when no one was listening. 6 months passed, the Rosa Martinez Scholarship awarded its first 5 recipients. Young people whose parents worked as housekeepers, nannies, maintenance workers, drivers. Kids with dreams and talents that might have stayed invisible without someone giving them a chance. Daniel's debut album, called Invisible, released in March. It topped the classical music charts and crossed over to mainstream success. Critics called it revolutionary. Audiences called it beautiful. Daniel called it honest. And in May, he performed at Carnegie Hall. The concert sold out in 2 hours. Rosa sat in the front row wearing a new dress that Margaret had insisted on buying for her. Margaret sat beside her, not in a box seat, not in some VIP section. Right there next to the woman who'd spent 15 years making her life run smoothly. When Daniel walked onto the stage, the audience erupted. He sat at the piano, took a breath, and began to play. Margaret watched Rosa's face as she listened to her son. The pride, the joy, the tears streaming down her cheeks. And Margaret understood that this moment, this recognition, this celebration of Daniel's genius, was only possible because Rosa had believed in him when no one else did. After the concert, they went backstage. Daniel was surrounded by people, but when he saw his mother, he pushed through the crowd and hugged her. You did it, mijo, Rosa whispered. You showed them who you are. We did it, Mama, Daniel corrected. We did it together. Margaret stood back, watching this moment that she was privileged to witness. Daniel noticed her and waved her over. Margaret, he said, there's someone I want you to meet. This is Professor Zhao from the conservatory. She's the one who first recognized what I could do. She's the reason I believed in myself enough to play my real music at your gala." Professor Zhao shook Margaret's hand warmly. "Daniel's extraordinary. I knew it the first time I heard him play. At a wedding in Queens," Margaret said. "I heard about that. You were there by accident and you actually listened. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're not looking for them," Professor Zhao said. "But only if we're actually paying attention." Margaret nodded. "That's a lesson I learned the hard way." Later that night, Margaret returned to her penthouse alone. The city sparkled below her windows. Millions of lights, millions of people. Each one living a life as complex and important as her own. She thought about Rosa, who was probably at home now, maybe finally writing again in those late-night hours. She thought about Daniel, whose life had transformed not because someone powerful had lifted him up, but because he'd lifted himself up and finally found people who could see him clearly. And she thought about herself. About the person she'd been 6 months ago, so certain of her own perceptions, so blind to the richness of life happening around her. Her phone buzzed, a text from Rosa. "Thank you for tonight. For seeing my son. For seeing me. It means more than you know." Margaret typed back carefully. "Thank you for teaching me to see. I have a lot to learn, but I'm trying." 3 dots appeared, then Rosa's response. "That's all any of us can do. Keep trying." Margaret set down her phone and looked out at the city again. Tomorrow, her driver James would pick her up. She'd realized recently she didn't even know his last name. Tomorrow, she'd ask. She'd ask about his life, his family, his furniture building that Daniel had mentioned. She'd actually listen to the answer. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to make up for all the years of not seeing. But it was a start. And sometimes Margaret was learning, starting to see was the most important step. In Washington Heights, Daniel sat at his keyboard, composing his next piece. This one was about transformation, about people learning to truly see each other, about second chances and hard truths and the courage it takes to change. He called it recognition. And when he played it, months later, in a small venue where the tickets were affordable and the audience was diverse, Margaret was there, not in a special seat, not being recognized or celebrated, just there listening, really listening, to music that told a story about people learning to see the value in everyone, not just the ones who fit their expectations. The music filled the room, and Margaret understood that this was Daniel's gift. Not just his talent, but his ability to take pain and blindness and transform them into something beautiful and true. When the final note faded, she applauded with everyone else. And in that moment, surrounded by people she didn't know, people whose stories she'd never hear, people whose talents she'd never witness, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Gratitude not for what she had, but for what she was finally learning to see.